Can federal officials just show up and monitor your local voting site? Or is that, I don't know, a massive step towards centralizing control over elections? Okay, let's try and attack this. The latest flashpoint in this whole battle over election integrity, it just hit two major Democratic states, like this week. We're diving into a whole stack of sources here, detailing the administration's policies on voting, on immigration, the huge legal pushback, and really why just casting a ballot has become this frontline skirmish over states' rights versus federal power.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What's really striking is the immediate, almost theatrical confrontation playing out. The core news is the Department of Justice announcing it's going to monitor polling sites. We're talking 7 jurisdictions for the upcoming off-year elections. That's 6 big California counties: Kern, Riverside, Fresno, Orange, Los Angeles, and Passaic County over in New Jersey.
Right. And the DOJ, under Attorney General Pamela Bondi, they're pretty explicit about why. They're saying it's necessary for, quote, transparency, ballot security, and compliance with federal law. Basically ensuring what they call the highest standards of election integrity. It feels like a very direct move to address public confidence, or maybe the lack of it.
And that confidence definitely seems to be an issue. Our sources show that public faith in election accuracy is, well, it's at a historic low. Over 30% of people are expressing doubts. So you could see this DOJ move as an attempt to tackle that doubt head on.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, right? California officials, Governor Newsom, Attorney General Bonta, they didn't waste any time. They immediately blasted the move, called it an act of voter intimidation and suppression. And they even suggested it's about laying groundwork to challenge future elections.
Exactly. And they didn't just put out press releases. California actually announced it's deploying its own state observers. Their job, to watch the federal monitors, essentially shadowing them. Yeah, they're framing the federal presence not as assistance, but as potential interference that needs watching itself to make sure the feds don't interfere unlawfully with California's process.
So it's turned into this like observation game where the watchers are being watched. How did the DOJ even respond to that?
Well, Harmeet Dhillon, who heads the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, basically said everyone needs to calm down. She stated, look, the DOJ has sent observers for decades. This is routine compliance stuff. But the choice of where they sent them is pretty key, isn't it? Targeting these specific places in an off-year election focused on state stuff like redistricting and a governor's race, not even a federal election.
Good point.
But it does suggest they might be testing the waters, pushing the boundaries of federal oversight, particularly in Democratic strongholds.
That choice of location, yeah, it really feeds into the whole states' rights question. And this monitoring, it's just one piece of a much bigger years-long fight over how we vote. What are the national policies, the ones in our source material, that are really driving this integrity versus participation debate right now?
The big one, the main driver, seems to be the push for stricter security rules, especially proof of a citizenship. The administration put out an executive order requiring proof of U.S. citizenship specifically for the federal voter registration form. Now, that specific order got blocked by a federal court later on.
Okay.
But the momentum behind demanding stricter controls, it really picked up steam after that.
And Congress got involved, too.
Yep. The U.S. House passed the Save Via Act Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. That goes even further. It would require specific documents, like a birth certificate or a passport, just to register.
Some pretty strict requirements.
Very strict. And the challenge here, as the sources point out, is how deeply polarized the view is on these rules. On one side, you have people prioritizing election integrity saying, look, these are basic security measures. But on the other, advocates are warning this could disenfranchise millions of perfectly legitimate voters.
Can you give an example? Like, who specifically might be affected by that?
Well, the sources highlight married women, for instance. Someone who changed their surname, maybe doesn't have easy access to an updated birth certificate or passport that matches their current legal name. And that's not some tiny group, right? It's potentially a significant hurdle, adds layers of complexity to just exercising a fundamental right. Critics absolutely frame that as voter suppression.
Okay, so beyond who's eligible, the administration also seemed to zero in on the mechanics, like mail ballots.
That's right. They specifically targeted federal funding for states that count mail ballots received after Election Day. California is a prime example, allowing up to 7 days later if it's postmarked on time.
And they tried to cut funding for that.
They tried, yeah. Argued it undermined election certainty. But that move, the funding cut provision, it also got blocked by a federal court. And that court decision was pretty significant. It basically reinforced that the Constitution gives states, not the White House, the authority to set election procedures and deadlines, a real line in the sand on separation of powers.
That's a huge theme running through all of this, isn't it? How far can the executive branch actually push its power? Which, raises the big question. How far can a president go with executive orders, and what happens when the courts push back?
Well, the sheer volume is something else. Since taking office, the president signed over 160 executive orders. Now, an EO basically tells federal agencies how to implement existing law. It can't just override a law passed by Congress, but that boundary, it's constantly being tested. That's why you see these immediate legal challenges.
And looking at that volume, you have to consider the signals being sent, right? Like, the administration used an EO to rescind Lyndon Johnson's historic order, the one requiring federal contractors to comply with civil rights obligations. Now, okay, it didn't overturn the actual civil rights laws, but what does a move like that signal about the administration's direction?
Critics argue it signals a pretty fundamental shift in priorities. By pulling back that specific enforcement order, the message seems to be that aggressively enforcing equal protection in federal contracting just isn't top of the list anymore, even if the laws themselves are still there.
We also see EOs used really heavily outside of voting. Immigration is a big one. Our sources mention how critics describe certain policies. They actually use the term white supremacy to characterize them, specifically pointing to things like prioritizing refugee status for Afrikaners based on what the sources call debunked claims of white genocide.
And that wasn't the only major shift through executive order. The administration also suspended the entire U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP. And they limited admissions to people who could, quote, fully and appropriately assimilate. Now, critics read that language as basically shutting the door on applicants who are mainly Black, brown, or Muslim, shifting the whole focus from humanitarian need to, well, cultural fit.
And we can't forget the attempt to revoke temporary protected status, TPS, for about 350,000 Venezuelan immigrants. The Supreme Court ultimately let that proceed by lifting a stay. So it's pretty clear the administration used executive power really aggressively to reshape enforcement eligibility across multiple areas.
And this is where the courts become the key check, the key arena. The administration turned to the Supreme Court a lot, often using the shadow docket.
Right, the shadow docket. What does that actually mean for how quickly things happen and for the groups trying to challenge these policies?
It means things can happen almost overnight. The shadow docket involves emergency applications decided fast, without the usual full briefings or oral arguments. The administration filed about 20 of these emergency applications, and they won in 15 out of 18 cases that got decided quickly. It's a way to fast-track policy implementation, sometimes before opponents even get a full hearing.
And the court also limited something else, didn't they? Nationwide injunctions. Now, wait, some might say that's just efficient letting policies move forward. Why do critics call it a patchwork system?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. See, previously, if a single district judge found a federal policy unconstitutional, they could issue a nationwide injunction stopping it everywhere while appeals happened. By limiting that power, critics say you get this patchwork of rights. A policy might be blocked in one state or circuit but continue elsewhere. So instead of one lawsuit potentially stopping a harmful policy nationwide, groups might have to sue in multiple places. It drastically slows down challenges.
Okay, so to really see how these big federal actions play out, we need to look at the local level, right? The sources detail some intense clashes, especially in California, where civil liberties groups have really fought back hard in court.
Absolutely. You see that clash starkly with immigration enforcement, which interestingly links back to the election monitoring we started with. Federal agents ran raids in California's Central Valley called Operation Return to Sender. And that region includes Kern County, one of the exact counties now set for DOJ election monitoring.
And the allegations during those raids were serious.
Incredibly serious, according to the sources. Accusations that agents arrested people, even legal residents and U.S. citizens, based on nothing more than their skin color. Reports of violent tactics like smashing car windows, holding people in freezing cells to try and coerce them into voluntary departure. Really troubling stuff.
So what happened? Did anyone push back legally?
Oh, yeah. The ACLU hit back hard. They filed a federal class action lawsuit, and it led to a pretty powerful result. A preliminary injunction covering the whole California Central Valley. That injunction specifically bars Border Patrol from stopping people unless they have a valid, specific reason to suspect they're non-citizens. And critically, it explicitly says skin color is not a valid reason.
Wow. So a direct legal check on those tactics. But the battles over elections themselves are happening locally, too, even inside California.
Definitely. San Diego Representative Darrell Issa sued the state over counting mail ballots that arrive up to 7 days after Election Day.
What's his argument there?
His argument is basically that it gives an unfair electoral advantage and might violate the state's own election timing rules. If he were to win, think about it, it could potentially disenfranchise hundreds of thousands in a state that leans heavily on mail voting. It just shows how every single procedural detail has become a political football, a potential way to challenge election outcomes.
And it goes even more local than that, right?
Yeah.
Huntington Beach.
Yep. Down to the city level. In Huntington Beach, voters actually approved a measure requiring photo ID to vote in their municipal elections. That directly challenges California state law, which doesn't allow local ID requirements like that. That fight is currently on appeal. It just demonstrates how this whole conflict over election rules is now happening everywhere, from D.C. down to city councils, reflecting that public doubt we talked about earlier.
So putting it all together, we've seen the executive branch really pushing the boundaries of its authority. Over 160 executive orders touching everything from refugee policy to how elections are run. And that's prompted immediate, very aggressive legal fights from groups like the ACLU and others.
Exactly. And the battle isn't just in Washington courtrooms. It's playing out in local counties where election officials, law enforcement, they're under constant scrutiny. It's where these core constitutional principles, who gets to vote, who's protected from federal power, are being tested every single day on the ground.
This whole conflict really underscores that checks and balances, they aren't just, dusty concepts in a textbook. They rely on constant vigilance. From political bodies, sure, but also from private advocacy groups, using every tool they have, courts, ballots, organizing.
It's an ongoing process of policing the boundaries of power.
So the final question for you listening to this is really this. When one side is shouting security and the other is shouting suppression, how do you figure out where legitimate governance crosses the line into an abuse of power? Especially when, as we've seen, even the courts seem to be struggling to find a consistent way to handle these rapid assertions of executive authority. It's something to think about.